Sociology that many of us are part of, kind of our roles in terms of teaching and principles of openness and inclusion, and how central that is to our role as scholars and teachers. Science within the current political climate that we're in regards to things in the environment and climate change. So I'm really interested in this discussion that Stellan's going to kick off. So it's my understanding we're going to have a talk, and then we're going to have some discussion and workshopping, brainstorming, and maybe there'll be some season. So with that, let me introduce Stellan. So Stellan Vinthagen is faculty in the Department of Sociology. He's also linked to our group in psychology, since the Balance program. We've been really lucky to have Stellan as part of our community since 2014. He's the inaugural holder, I always get this wrong, and the chair to study nonviolent direct action and civil resistance. And kind of subsequent to coming and holding this chair, Stellan launched an initiative in resistance studies. So that's kind of his perspective on integrating those ideas embodied in his chair. So Stellan's by training a sociologist, a peace scholar. He's really unique, and we're so fortunate at UMass to have him as part of our community because he is really one of the top scholars in civil resistance in the world. But he himself also has a long history and continues to this day to be an activist, and really is involved in doing a lot of training of nonviolent resistance methods. So we're really lucky to have somebody who can talk as a scholar, who can talk as an activist, but also perhaps for today, talk to somebody who's been involved in training and helping to build resistance groups and kind of what those communities do. So please join me in welcoming Stellan.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for showing up today. I'll talk about my reflections when it comes to resistance in the times we're living in now, and I will keep to less than 40 minutes. That will give us about close to an hour to discuss. We live in a dangerous situation today, and with a very limited time frame for serious system change to deal with, among other things, the acute climate crisis, at the same time as there is a growing international trend towards authoritarian politics. And Trump is one key example of that danger. He symbolizes it with his authoritarian personality and denial of an environmental crisis and the facts around that. At the same time, I think there are reasons for hope. As Naomi Klein says, the climate crisis makes system change not only an option, but something that is a necessity for civilization and survival. So system change is now realistic. It's something that is not just suggested by revolutionaries, but something that is of necessity for us all. And we do have an unprecedented mobilization of resistance going on in the US. And which you might not be aware of, but the last 2 decades we've had an unprecedented mobilization of resistance around in the world, particularly in the third world. So there are reasons for hope. But since these times are dangerous, I want to take a step back and reflect upon our situation right now. We cannot afford to make our actions at the spur of the moment, only reacting to the stupid policies coming from the White House in every day or week. I think we need to act in a grounded way, based on a plan and with wisdom. I offer a view here today as, on the one hand, maybe an expert on resistance studies, but also an outside view from a resident alien. I am a nonviolent Viking coming from Scandinavia, Northern Europe. I have visited 5 states since the election, talked to many groups and interviewed activists, and have searched a lot on the internet. I'm a news junkie. But I'm happy to be corrected by you for if there are things in my analysis that you don't agree with. So I hope we will have that discussion. I will start with a summary of what I want to put forward, and then I will develop what I see as the challenges facing us, and I will end up with a proposal of what I think is needed to be done. So the main points first. Defending Trump is just a dangerous symptom. He is not the problem itself. He is a symptom of a political and social failure in the US, of the political system, of the social situation. And the current resistance wave that we see is really hopeful, and it is unprecedented, but it also shows a couple of problems. In my understanding, there are three things that I see as problematic with the ongoing resistance now, and that seems to be a focus on large, one-off protests. Secondly, it seems to be reaction-based tactics. On what happens in the White House, we react to that. Thirdly, it seems to be very focused on the person, Trump, which I think is a mistake. So I understand it as that Trump is sitting safer and stronger than Obama ever did. He has the Congress behind him. He has probably the Supreme Court behind him. He's not affected by protesting liberals in the street. He doesn't really care about what the media is writing. And he and his regime is preparing really strong repression against protests. So we should be aware of that. And I don't see any problem for him to get re-elected on the wave of a patriotic reaction to perhaps a terrorist threat to this country. So we are facing perhaps 8 years of this regime. But more importantly, I think that getting rid of Trump is not going to solve the deeper system problems that we see here. The risk is that the resistance mobilization that we are seeing now loses its energy and momentum much too early during this 8-year period, that it creates more of a divide that already exists in this society by only uniting liberals and minorities and resisting an after all, elected president. So what I'm proposing, and I'll develop 6 points later on, is a long-term strategy of social change. Real leverage based on a sustainable movement mobilizing the support of the majority for necessary reforms in the coming decade. Protest events and rallying against Trump can be used for that purpose, for sure. So what's going on right now could be part of this. But then it has to be strategically selecting red lines where people really feel that this is not acceptable. But the approach of the struggle, I think, needs to shift to focus on building a sustainable social change movement instead of what we're seeing right now. So let me go into the arguments of this. I think what we're seeing is really something unprecedented, both in terms of its level and its scope. So what we're seeing is new groups being mobilized that before didn't do resistance. We had 900 Foreign Office employees that signed, in the risk of their jobs, a critique against the Muslim ban of travels. We have scientists mobilizing for a protest next month. We have even Starbucks and Microsoft voicing their critique. We have museums that take away the paintings of immigrants to show the importance of immigrants in this country. We have former Congress staffers that formulated a handbook of how to do pressure politics in the organization Indivisible. We have activation of those that never did civil disobedience before or protests. But we also have the reactivation of those older activists that were active before and hasn't been active for many years. And we have a higher level of mobilization. The town hall protests all over the country by what is now being branded as the herbal Tea Party. We already, with the Women's March, had the biggest protest in US history. We have the revival of the sanctuary movement, giving protection to those people that are threatened to be thrown out. No less than 11 million undocumented people in this country, it's estimated. We have the immigrant strikes of a day without immigrants. And there is virtually one major protest every weekend in DC by women, American Indians, scientists, immigrants, climate activists, etc. It's even hard to have an overview of what's going on. And for that purpose, Michael Moore created the Resistance Calendar that is trying to collect what's going on. And the level of donations are also unprecedented. The ACLU, they got donations of 80 million since the election. So this is astonishing and hopeful. But there's also another aspect that is hopeful here, and that is that with someone like Trump that attacks so many different things of importance for climate, minorities, democracy, and everything, he brings forward new alliances between groups that wasn't really possible before. We see how climate, racism, sexism, militarism, corporate dominance, the 99%, civil rights, democracy, and so on are starting to link between each other. That is hopeful. But we also see unlikely alliances. Alliances that would not have been possible before the election. Like between Muslims and Jewish people to protect the religious freedoms. We have the Muslim registry. You know, people signing up voluntarily saying, yes, I am a Muslim, and yes, please register me. And among those signing up for that are the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, not known to be a protester, not known to be a liberal. And, I'm told, a famous actor within the Big Bang Theory group. So that kind of shows the wide spectra of what kind of getting mobilized here. But we are also facing something of a challenge that is extraordinary, and I want to spend some time on that. So I think we are facing an unusually insular regime. It's very self-sufficient and don't respect the media image they create. They don't care about facts, or contradictions in their own statements. They don't care about expert opinions. And they don't care about protests by liberals. And we need to be clear that it's not just Trump that is doing this kind of extreme politics. It is a Republican Trumpism we are seeing. It's Republican representatives that upholds this regime. This regime of corporate dominance and wealth care. So, what I'm suggesting that we're seeing here is an extreme version of what has been built up for a long time. And it's only if we see it like that, I propose, that we will be able to come with an answer to the situation we are facing. I think that what we're seeing is a result of what very much started under neoconservative and neoliberal policies that's been going on since the 1980s. Where the richest people have got more wealth, and the working class and the middle class have got less. That has created a superpower without protection of the unemployed, the poor, or the precarious, the working poor. Where the Democrats have lost, over the decades, its support from the white working class in the rural areas. It's a political system failure, not only a socio-economic failure that we see from these policies. We're seeing that voting is not working in this country. Very few people are voting in the first place. Very often less than 50%. Very few people are getting registered. And even the person that wins the president election don't get the most votes, but actually less votes than the loser. It's a result of the majority system, the redrawing of voting districts, the electoral college and all that. We know all these kind of things, right? But there's also the problem that there's only two options in this democracy that you have in this country. You're forced to choose between two. And that creates absurd choices. And I'm sure that many people voted against Clinton in not voting for Trump. Because their anger, their feeling of betrayal of the elites in Washington were so strong. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but I would say that I very much rely on this study done by Princeton in 2014 that shows that the United States is not a democracy. It's actually a plutocracy. It is a country ruled by the economic elites. It is not a democracy, and that's something we need to kind of address. So with a failure of the political system, I also think that there is a need for social change that are fundamental. But we also have to, unfortunately, see that Trump is also a part of an international trend towards authoritarianism. So we have seen this happening in India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Egypt, and many other places where we see the growing of neo-fascist parties and right-wing populism in Europe. I come from a country where 20% of the population are voting on neo-fascists. But because we have not a majority system, they are possible to isolate. In Sweden, everyone is registered automatically to vote. It's not like here, becoming increasingly difficult to become a voter. So in my opinion, if you combine staggering economic inequality with social insecurity and major cultural differences within this country of the United States, with a plutocracy, not a democracy, but a plutocracy, you get elite politics of demagogic kind that utilizes race, gender, religion, etc. as rhetoric diversions away from the wealth accumulation that is going on from the elite. So right now we're living in a situation where basically it's the judicial system with some judges. There are some dissenting Republicans and the FBI and others that are blocking much of the policies that is going on right now. But what I'm saying is that that's not going to solve the problem. In my view, there's only one way to solve the problem. And I'll get back to that. But I think there has to be a realization that the United States is not living in a situation of a functioning democracy and a progressive system that suddenly failed with Trump being elected. I think this country lives on two very prevalent mythologies, the land of opportunity and the best democracy in the world. The fact is that my country, Sweden, is having more of social mobility between economic classes than that exists in this country. This country is more of a brutal class society. So what we have is not the American dream, but the American nightmare. And a lot of people that are poor, that are immigrants, that are undocumented, that are coming from communities of American Indians or the LGBTQ communities, they have lived that nightmare for a long time. So now we are all facing it. So in my view, there's only one possibility to deal with this, really, and that's create necessary system reforms. I'm not talking about utopian system reforms, not necessarily revolutionary ones, but there are necessary ones that needs to be done. And in order to do that, I think the only possibility is a broad-based popular movement that unites large segments of society and gets the support of a clear majority for these reforms. That is the challenge, I think. And I think we can learn from those countries around in the world that for several decades have faced authoritarian regimes, like in India, for example, like in South Africa, And in my travels around in the world and in my studies of these resistance movements, there are a couple of things that comes up as key for withstanding authoritarianism. And that is creating resilience, creating broad alliances, creativity of your tactics and strategy, and creating leverage that really matters. So that's why I'm having 6 proposals here for a way forward. I think we need, firstly, a long-term strategy, thinking about the 2 years until the midterm elections, the 4 years until the next election, and the 8 years until Trump will have to be replaced. Hoping that the democratic system and safeguards that do exist are still valid, and that he will step down then. The long-term strategy needs to formulate goals that are clear and have a step-by-step plan, assessing and dealing with the strengths and the weaknesses of the existing opposition and the regime. To take that into account, to have a plan of how this is going to be achieved. The second thing would be to focus on movement building. Not so much the one-off large protests, but using the protests as ways of building the movement for the longer term. To bring in single-issue campaigns into collaboration and alliances. To focus on trainings where people learn new skills, communication, infrastructure that makes a movement strong, able to sustain for a longer period. Thirdly, I think we have to think about creating leverage. Since, at least according to my understanding, this regime don't really care. I mean, Trump personally probably care because he would like everyone to agree with him, but this regime doesn't really care about liberals walking in the thousands on the street or bad mass media. So a couple of entry points when it comes to creating leverage, just as ideas that could be further discussed, are mobilizing those Republicans that really care about rights and democracy, those that would be able to stand up against Trump. There's already been several of them standing up against the Muslim ban. We'll need more of that. Then we have boycotts. They are relatively safe tactics where people don't suffer any much of punishment and where we could have high participation. There's already been a partly successful boycott of Ivana Trump's fashion collection. And there are boycott apps circulating where you can easily check what brands are connected to the regime. But then there's the more risky one and very powerful tax resistance. Why should ordinary working people pay taxes when billionaires like Trump don't pay taxes? That could be a really powerful message, and a lot of people could go along that. But it's risky. Then it's the leverage possibility of creating general national strikes, which has been really important in overthrowing other regimes in the history and other parts of the world. But it's going to be hard in the US because there's a low unionization of workers. But targeted groups like immigrants could do that if they get more organized. Then we have all the liberal majors and the states that already declare themselves to be sanctuaries, protecting immigrants. They could create alliances and create resistance. I know that the regime is suggesting to withdraw federal funding, but that's actually not so easy to do. There are legal safeguards for when you can do that also. So this could be a possibility. It's actually already 50% of all the counties in this country that have most of the undocumented immigrants. 50% of those counties are already declared themselves to be sanctuaries. So this could be a powerful way forward. We also need mass civil disobedience against particular unjust laws or policies the kind of red lines where ordinary people would feel that this is not acceptable. I don't know where red lines are. We need to figure that out. But for example, the Keystone pipeline that's just been approved by Trump again. Fourthly, I think we need to prepare for and expose the repression that is going on. There are a lot of frontline communities, like minorities, people of color, American Indians, and others that are already suffering under this situation. But a lot of us are going to be drawn into this. People that have looked on the suggested law changes, where there are increased punishments and new laws against protests, are saying that they have not seen things like this in the last 40 years. There are even suggestions in some states to declare environmental civil disobedience actions as being ecological terrorism. So we need support structures that deal with this repression that is already here and will increase. Organizing prison visits, financial support to families that are affected by repression, self-help groups, legal and psychological support to people that are affected. Fifthly, I think we need to build dialogue and collaboration across divides in this country. This might be controversial what I'm saying now, but I think it's really key. I think we need to reach out to the groups that are the voter base of Trump. We have to build on and understand their genuine and real frustrations with their socioeconomic situation of unemployment, poor conditions in the rural areas, feelings of betrayal over decades. And we need to find practical, liberal, democratic solutions to address these problems. And we need to be trustworthy in having suggestions of what to do with these real problems. And I'm not sure even it should be a discussion about voting or Trump. It should maybe be directly a discussion about what could practically be done about their real problems. And from that building of trust, maybe later on, there could be a political understanding of what to do. Because it is a paradox. It is a paradox of many people that are actually losing on the policies that this regime is implementing, have been voting on them. That it speaks to a failure of the left. It speaks to a failure of actually being able to be relevant to these groups. So I think that is necessary. And the last point I have is that I think, so besides doing resistance, besides doing dialogue, we need to have an attractive vision about what we are all about. We need a vision for a different United States, based on equality and dignity for all, that inspires peoples across divides to join up for doing something else. I don't know what that would look like, but I think we need to work on that kind of vision. Perhaps under banners like, America is a country of immigrants, or patriots care for all Americans. I'm very uncomfortable with the word patriot. We don't use that very much in Sweden, but I know it's very popular here. If we did all these things, I think we could change the patterns of voting. We could change the Republican Party. We could change the Democratic Party. We could open up space for real democracy. And I know what I'm saying is something that is a huge task, but I think there's no way around it. I mean, Trump is a symptom that shows that this political, economic, social system is not working. And then we cannot focus on getting rid of Trump. It will not solve the problem. So, lastly, I want to end on the note of that there is hope. The research in my area shows that it's enough if 3.5% of the population is sustaining protests on the street to overthrow a regime. That doesn't sound like very much. Yes. And the reason why it is only 3.5% is because it's shown in many studies that if people are out on the street, there are a lot more people that support those that are on the street. So something like 5 times or 10 times more people support those that are on the street protesting. So 3.5% is a signal of a majority that is against the regime, right? However, this is a bit complicated, more complicated than 3.5% sounds, because it's 11 million people. And you need to sustain that. That's why I'm talking about the sustainable movement. And also, we have an added problem with the democracy. Because after all, in some sort of very flawed way, Trump is elected according to the system. That gives him some legitimacy. So the only way to show that this movement is not anti-democratic, but in reality a democratic reform movement, is to show that it has a larger support among the people. That's why I'm talking about broad-based movement that attracts the support of the majority. I don't think you can stand up against a democratically elected regime with just being effective with civil disobedience. There is a matter of the legitimacy you need to address. However, overthrowing a regime is far much easier than creating a just and democratic society. So I think we need to build on the tradition that exists within nonviolent movements, building from Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on, that the movement itself needs to embody the values, the human right, the democracy that we believe in. It needs to be part of the way the movement is working, so we are actually building towards a system change, not just regime change. So I think there is hope. I think the Trump regime is also a sign of a desperate move by the corporate elites to take on direct rule. After decades of successful hidden rule, which is most likely spurred by their fear of environmental politics, the social justice politics, and the increasingly clear failures of the world free market orientation of politics since the 1980s, and of popular power in overthrowing regimes, what we see, I think, is corporate rule behind the scenes stepping forward and taking control of the governments. Trump and Bernie represent very different politics, but in a similar way, a rebellion against mainstream politics as usual and the Washington elite dominance within the US. So I think we are seeing a more long-term polarization in society, and that polarization is actually a possibility. We shouldn't be afraid of that polarization in itself, I think. The problem is the polarization within the population, dividing and between different regions and different groups in society. That is a problematic polarization. But I think there is a need of a polarization between ordinary people and those elites that do have the control of the political economic power in this country in an outstanding way. And I think that it's only a progressive movement, broad-based, sustained, that is able to change the situation and create a polarization where the real enemies of the American people are pointed out. So, thank you. That was less than 40 minutes. Now I would like us to work together on this. So what I'm suggesting now is that we talk in groups of 4 people. Preferably you speak with people that you don't know. grab 3 other people, take the chairs, sit down in a group of 4, and discuss what needs to be done in order to sustain an effective resistance to the present regime. What needs to be done in order to sustain an effective resistance to the regime that we have now? And you will get papers. You can write down what ideas you come up with, and we will be able to circulate that to others later on through the mailing list that is now circulating somewhere here. After that, we will talk shortly in pairs to talk about what could I do. And then we will have a Q&A, the last part of the time until 2. All right? That's the plan. Okay, so 15 minutes in groups of 4. Grab some paper.